Marcus Caldwell, an environmental survey technician, 32 years old, was performing routine water level measurements at Pine Lake State Park that morning in September of 2019. The summer had been exceptionally hot, with record-breaking temperatures. That left the once thriving lake at its lowest recorded level in 5 decades. He had been assigned to document the environmental impact of the severe drought on the local ecosystem. It was then that his equipment detected an unusual metal signature beneath the newly exposed shoreline. At first, Marcus thought it might be an old fishing boat or perhaps discarded machinery from decades past. But when he cleared away layers of dried mud and algae with his tools, Marcus realized that he was looking at the roof of a submerged vehicle. The rusted metal had deteriorated significantly, but the outline of what appeared to be a van was unmistakable against the cracked, dry lake bed. What he had found had been there for 41 years. The metal frame was nearly consumed by rust and lake sediment, creating an eerie red-brown tomb beneath the waterline. And most disturbing, when authorities arrived to investigate further, they discovered this was not simply an abandoned vehicle, but something far more sinister. This discovery would forever change a 4-decade-old mystery that had tormented the small community of Pinewood Creek and the families of 3 young boys who had vanished without a trace. Pinewood Creek was a small, close-knit community, nestled between rolling forests and the pristine waters of Pine Lake in rural Michigan. The town itself had barely 2,000 residents in 1978, most employed at the local paper mill or commuting to larger cities for work. The summers in Pinewood Creek were characterized by warm breezes, the smell of pine, and the excited chatter of children enjoying their school break. For many local families, Pine Lake Summer Camp represented a cherished tradition that had been operating since the early 1950s. The camp was run by Richard Thornton, a 56-year-old former physical education teacher who had purchased the property in 1965. Thornton was well respected in the community, known for his charitable work with local youth organizations and his seemingly endless enthusiasm for outdoor activities. He had transformed the modest campground into a popular summer destination that attracted children from across the state. The Pine Lake Summer Camp employed mostly college students as counselors, with 2 permanent staff members. Michael Davis, 34, served as the assistant director and maintenance supervisor, while Thomas Weber, 41, managed administration and parent communications. July of 1978 saw one of the largest enrollment seasons for Pine Lake Camp, with nearly 120 campers scheduled in various sessions throughout the summer. Among them were 3 14-year-old boys who had been friends since elementary school. Jason Miller was the son of the local pharmacist, known for his academic achievements and interest in photography. Christopher Walker, whose father worked at the paper mill, was an avid reader with aspirations of becoming a journalist. Timothy Bennett, whose mother was a teacher at the local elementary school, was interested in nature and had an encyclopedic knowledge of local wildlife. The 3 boys had been looking forward to their 2-week session at Pine Lake Camp for months. Their parents later recalled how they had saved their allowance to purchase new flashlights, pocket knives, and disposable cameras for the trip. The session began on July 5th with the usual round of swimming tests, cabin assignments, and orientation activities. According to camp records and witness accounts, the first week proceeded without incident. The boys participated in hiking expeditions, learned basic survival skills, and enjoyed evening campfires with stories and songs. On the morning of July 12th, Counselor Brian Wilson conducted the daily cabin check at breakfast and noticed that Jason, Christopher, and Timothy were not present. He initially assumed they had gone to the bathrooms or perhaps left early for a scheduled nature hike. However, when they failed to appear for the morning activities, a search of the campgrounds was initiated. Their sleeping bags appeared to have been slept in, but their backpacks and some personal items were missing. Richard Thornton called the local sheriff at approximately 11:30 that morning to report the missing boys. He informed Sheriff Dale Parker that a canoe was also missing from the boathouse, suggesting the boys had taken an unauthorized pre-dawn excursion onto the lake. This theory gained credibility when a storm had moved through the area the previous night, with winds strong enough to create dangerous conditions on the water for inexperienced boaters. The next 72 hours saw an intensive search operation. The sheriff department brought in boats to drag the lake. Volunteers from Pinewood Creek formed search parties to comb the surrounding woods. A helicopter from the state police assisted for one day, scanning the shoreline and adjacent forest areas. The missing canoe was discovered capsized on the eastern shore of the lake, approximately 2 miles from the camp, lending further credence to the drowning theory. Sheriff Parker held a press conference on July the 15th, stating that while the search would continue, the evidence strongly suggested a tragic boating accident had claimed the lives of the 3 boys. The families refused to accept this conclusion, insisting their sons were experienced swimmers and would not have attempted such a dangerous outing. Nevertheless, after 10 days of searching without success, the active rescue operation was scaled back to periodic patrols. The Pine Lake Summary camp session was cut short, with parents arriving to collect their children early. Many expressed shock and dismay, but Richard Thornton assured them it was a tragic accident, resulting from the poor judgment of 3 teenagers who had broken camp rules. The summer camp would remain closed for the remainder of the season out, of respect for the families, Thornton announced, but would reopen the following year with enhanced safety measures. By the end of July, the disappearance of Jason Miller, Christopher Walker, and Timothy Bennett had become a painful mystery that hung over Pinewood Creek like a dark cloud. 3 families were left with unanswered questions, empty bedrooms, and a growing suspicion that they had not been told the whole truth about what happened at Pine Lake Camp. The years following the disappearance of the 3 boys brought dramatic changes to Pinewood Creek. The once popular Pine Lake Summer Camp never reopened after the 1978 incident. Richard Thornton sold the property in 1979 to a development company that had plans to transform it into a resort, though those plans eventually fell through due to economic recession. The camp buildings remained abandoned, slowly decaying at the edge of the lake, becoming a forbidden place that local children dared each other to visit on Halloween nights. Michael Davis and Thomas Weber, the 2 permanent staff members, left town within months of the incident. Davis reportedly moved to Oregon to work at another summer camp, while Weber found employment at a private school in Illinois. Their abrupt departures raised eyebrows among some community members, but most attributed it to the trauma of the incident and the closure of their workplace. For the families of Jason, Christopher, and Timothy, time did not heal their wounds, but merely transformed their grief into a different kind of pain. The Millers divorced 2 years after their son vanished, the stress of the tragedy having created an insurmountable rift in their marriage. Margaret Miller moved to Detroit, while her ex-husband Robert remained in Pinewood Creek, dedicating his spare time to reviewing the case files and searching for new evidence. The Walkers channeled their grief into advocacy, establishing a foundation for missing children that provided resources for search operations across Michigan. The organization helped numerous families over the decades, though they never found answers about their own son. Linda Bennett, Timothy's mother, suffered a nervous breakdown in 1982 and spent several months in a psychiatric facility. Upon her release, she became reclusive, rarely leaving her home except to visit the lake on the anniversary of her son's disappearance. Sheriff Dale Parker retired in 1985, but the case continued to haunt him. In a local newspaper interview conducted in 1988 for the 10-year anniversary of the disappearance, Parker admitted that certain aspects of the investigation had always troubled him. The discovery of the canoe had seemed too convenient, and the storm damage to it appeared inconsistent with what would be expected from natural causes. However, without bodies or additional evidence, there was little the department could do to pursue alternative theories. While the visible world of Pinewood Creek carried on with this unresolved tragedy, a darker truth remained hidden beneath the waters of Pine Lake. What actually occurred on that July night in 1978 was far more sinister than anyone had imagined. Richard Thornton had established Pine Lake Summer Camp with motivations beyond providing wholesome outdoor experiences for children. By the mid-1970s, he had transformed the remote facility into the hub of an operation that exploited vulnerable young campers. Together with Michael Davis and Thomas Weber, Thornton had been running a child exploitation ring that produced and distributed inappropriate photographs of minors to wealthy clients across the country. The operation was carefully orchestrated. The three men would identify potential targets during each camp session, usually boys without siblings attending the same session. Using their positions of authority, they would separate these children from the group for special photography sessions, claiming to document camp activities for promotional materials or awards. A small cabin, officially designated as a photography, darkroom and equipment storage, served as their operational center, located in a secluded area of the campground away from the main facilities. Thomas Weber handled the business aspects, maintaining contact with clients and managing the distribution of materials through private mail services. Michael Davis, with his maintenance duties, ensured the security of their operation, installing additional locks on the photography cabin and monitoring the campgrounds for any potential discovery of their activities. Richard Thornton, as the respected camp director, provided the perfect cover and handled the actual photography. For 3 summers, their operation continued undetected, protected by the isolation of the camp and the trust placed in them by parents and the community. However, in July 1978, their carefully constructed facade began to crumble because of the curiosity of 3 14-year-old boys. Jason Miller had developed an interest in photography and had brought his own camera to camp. His desire to learn more about developing photographs led him to investigate the darkroom cabin during free time. On the night of July 11th, Jason convinced his friends Christopher and Timothy to accompany him on a covert mission to explore the restricted building. Using a pocket knife, Jason managed to jimmy open a window that had been left slightly ajar. Inside, the boys discovered not only photography equipment, but also financial records, correspondence with clients, and most damning photographs and negatives that revealed the true nature of the operation. Horrified by what they found, the boys gathered what evidence they could, including a roll of film that contained incriminating images, and fled the cabin. Their plan was desperate but determined. They knew they needed to get this evidence to authorities immediately, but feared that the camp staff might intercept them if they attempted to use the camp office telephone. Instead, they decided to take one of the maintenance vehicles, an old van that Michael Davis used for supply runs, and drive to the sheriff's station in town. None of them had driving experience beyond occasional lessons from their parents, but the urgency of their discovery outweighed their caution. As the boys attempted to start the van in the pre-dawn hours of July 12th, they were spotted by Thomas Weber, who was returning from an errand in town. Weber immediately alerted Thornton and Davis. The 3 men confronted the boys as they were, struggling to navigate the van down the camp access road. Pretending concern, Thornton convinced the boys to stop the vehicle, claiming they were only putting themselves in danger and that whatever problem they had could be resolved through proper channels. Once the boys were back under their control, Thornton discovered the stolen evidence. Realizing their operation was compromised, the 3 men made a fateful decision. They could not risk exposure, which would mean certain imprisonment, and, thus, destruction of their livelihoods. That night, after the camp had been told the boys had taken a canoe and presumably drowned, Thornton, Davis, and Weber executed their plan to eliminate the threat permanently. They drove the boys, bound and hidden in the back of the same van they had attempted to escape in, to a remote boat launch on the opposite side of Pine Lake. There they weighted the vehicle with concrete blocks from a nearby construction site, disabled the lock so the doors could not be opened from inside, and pushed it into the deepest part of the lake. To support their cover story, they planted the canoe on the eastern shore, deliberately damaging it to suggest a boating accident. For 41 years, Pine Lake kept this secret in its murky depths, while above the surface, families mourned. Authorities remained puzzled, and 3 guilty men continued their lives, bound by their shared crime, but eventually scattered by the weight of their actions. In the summer of 2018, Eleanor Winters, a 72-year-old former camp counselor who had worked at Pine Lake during the 1978 season, was diagnosed with terminal cancer. The doctors gave her approximately 1 year to live. This diagnosis triggered a period of reflection and regret for Eleanor, who had carried a heavy burden of suspicion and guilt for 4 decades. Eleanor had been 27 years old when she worked at Pine Lake Camp, serving as the arts and crafts instructor for the summer session. On the night the boys disappeared, she had been awake due to insomnia and had observed unusual activity near the director's cabin. She had seen Richard Thornton and the other 2 staff members loading what appeared to be equipment into a van around 3 in the morning. At the time, she had thought little of it, assuming they were preparing for a special activity the next day. When the boys were reported missing the following morning and the story about the stolen canoe emerged, Eleanor began to have doubts. The timing of the nocturnal activities she had witnessed seemed suspicious in retrospect. Additionally, she had overheard a heated argument between Thornton and Davis the day before the disappearance, during which Davis had mentioned someone poking around the darkroom. Despite her misgivings, Eleanor had remained silent. As a young woman with no concrete evidence, she feared the repercussions of accusing such respected community figures of wrongdoing. She convinced herself that her suspicions were merely the product of an overactive imagination. After the camp closed, she returned to college, eventually becoming an elementary school teacher in another state. Over the years, the guilt of her silence grew. She followed news of the case from afar, clipping newspaper articles and searching for information online. When social media emerged, she joined groups dedicated to unsolved mysteries and missing persons cases, anonymously following discussions about the Pine Lake disappearances. The faces of the 3 boys haunted her dreams, their youth forever preserved in the fading newspaper photographs she had collected. With her mortality now squarely before her, Eleanor decided she could no longer keep her suspicions to herself. In October 2018, she contacted the Michigan State Police Cold Case Unit, providing a detailed statement about what she had witnessed that night and her reasons for suspecting foul play. Her statement alone was not enough to reopen the case, but it did prompt investigators to review the original files. Detective Samantha Foster, a veteran cold case investigator, was assigned to assess the new information. She traveled to Pinewood Creek in November 2018, interviewing surviving witnesses and family members. The investigation gained little traction until Foster discovered that Thomas Weber had died in 2010, leaving behind a storage unit in Chicago that had never been claimed or cleared out. After obtaining a warrant, Foster discovered a locked metal box containing photographs, documents, and most significantly, a personal journal in which Weber had documented aspects of the Pine Lake operation, though in coded language. The journal contained references to profits, clients, and a crisis situation in July 1978 that was resolved permanently. While not explicit enough to provide conclusive evidence of a crime, the materials heightened suspicions and justified allocating additional resources to the investigation. Detective Foster tracked down Michael Davis to a small town in Washington state, where he had been living under a slightly altered name. When confronted with the evidence from Weber's storage unit, Davis became visibly distressed, but maintained his innocence. He claimed any inappropriate activities at the camp had been solely Thornton's doing, and that he had left Michigan to escape association with the tragedy. Richard Thornton proved more difficult to locate. Records indicated he had moved frequently after selling the camp, living in at least 6 different states before seemingly disappearing from official records around 2005. Further investigation revealed he had died in a nursing home in Florida in 2015, having suffered from dementia in his final years. With the primary suspects either uncooperative or deceased, the investigation might have stalled again if not for the unprecedented drought that hit Michigan in the summer of 2019. As Pine Lake receded to historic low levels, areas of the lake bed that had been submerged for generations became exposed. It was in this environment that Marcus Caldwell made his grim discovery, providing the physical evidence that Eleanor Winters had set in motion. The recovery operation for the submerged van began on September 18, 2019, coordinated by the Michigan State Police Underwater Recovery Unit in conjunction with local authorities. The process was painstaking, as 4 decades underwater had left the vehicle in a fragile condition. Specialized equipment was brought in to carefully raise the van without disturbing potential evidence. News of the discovery spread quickly through Pinewood Creek, drawing crowds of onlookers to the cordoned-off area of shoreline. Among them were Robert Miller and the Walkers, now in their 70s, watching silently as the lake potentially yielded answers they had sought for a lifetime. The van was successfully extracted on September 20th and transported to a secure facility for forensic examination. The initial inspection confirmed the worst fears. 3 sets of skeletal remains were discovered inside the vehicle, positioned in the rear cargo area. Preliminary anthropological assessment indicated the remains belonged to adolescent males consistent with the ages of the missing boys. Personal effects found among the remains included a metal watch identified by Robert Miller as belonging to his son, Jason, a distinctive belt buckle recognized by the Walkers as a gift they had given Christopher, and a Boy Scout pocket knife, with the initials TB carved into the handle. The forensic investigation revealed other disturbing details. The van doors had been deliberately disabled, making them impossible to open from the inside. Concrete blocks were found in the vehicle, explaining how it had sunk so quickly and remained submerged for decades. Most significant was the discovery of restraints, including rope and chain fragments, that had survived the long immersion. This evidence contradicted the accidental drowning narrative that had been accepted for 41 years, confirming that the boys had been victims of a deliberate criminal act. Perhaps the most remarkable discovery was a waterproof camera case containing an undeveloped roll of film. The case, designed for underwater photography, had protected its contents from water damage. Forensic technicians were able to carefully process the film using specialized techniques for degraded materials. The developed photographs provided the final pieces of the tragic puzzle. The images on the film documented what the boys had discovered in the darkroom cabin. There were photographs of financial ledgers showing payments from clients, lists of campers with certain names highlighted, and most damning, images of the darkroom itself, with equipment used for producing and duplicating inappropriate photographs. One photograph showed Richard Thornton standing beside Thomas Weber, both smiling as they held what appeared to be packages ready for mailing. The boys had created a visual record of the evidence before attempting their escape. Additional investigation of the van revealed trace evidence connecting it directly to Richard Thornton, Michael Davis, and Thomas Weber. Fingerprints matched those on file for all 3 men, and fibers consistent with the type of clothing they were known to wear were recovered from the driver and passenger areas. Most damning was a signet ring found lodged beneath the driver's seat, identified as belonging to Richard Thornton through camp photographs from the period. As news of these discoveries became public, Michael Davis attempted to flee his home in Washington. He was apprehended by local authorities and extradited to Michigan to face charges related to the deaths of the 3 boys and the operation of the exploitation ring. During interrogation, confronted with the overwhelming evidence, Davis finally confessed to his role in the crimes. According to his confession, the plan to silence the boys had been primarily orchestrated by Thornton, who had the most to lose if their operation was exposed. Weber had suggested making it look like an accident, and Davis had provided the technical knowledge to disable the van and ensure it would sink properly. Davis claimed he had wanted to simply frighten the boys into silence, but Thornton had insisted. They could not risk exposure. The 3 men had worked together to restrain the boys, drive them to the remote boat launch, and send the van into the lake with its young prisoners trapped inside. The investigation expanded to identify clients of the exploitation ring based on records found in Weber's storage unit and additional materials recovered from a hidden safe in the former camp property, discovered after authorities executed a search warrant on the now abandoned buildings. This broader investigation led to numerous arrests across the country, as individuals who had purchased materials from Thornton's operation were identified and prosecuted. Perhaps the most chilling revelation came from the discovery of a suicide note in Richard Thornton's personal effects, located in a safety deposit box that was accessed through court order. The note, apparently written in 2010 as his health began to decline, contained a partial confession to the murders at Pine Lake. Thornton wrote that he could no longer live with the memories of what they had done to protect themselves. He specifically mentioned hearing the boys crying for help as the van sank beneath the water. He had apparently intended to take his own life at that time, but had never followed through, instead living his remaining years in what he described as a personal hell of guilt and fear of discovery. The communities of the victims responded with collective shock and grief at these revelations. Memorial services were held for Jason, Christopher, and Timothy, allowing for a proper mourning process that had been denied to their families for 4 decades. The services were attended by hundreds of community members, including many former campers who had attended Pine Lake during the years of its operation, some traveling from across the country to pay their respects. The legal consequences of the Pine Lake case unfolded rapidly following the discovery of the van and its contents. Michael Davis, at 75 years old, was charged with 3 counts of first-degree murder, kidnapping, criminal conspiracy, and numerous charges related to the exploitation operation. Given his advanced age and deteriorating health, there was significant public debate about whether he would live to see his trial completed. The trial began in March 2020, drawing national media attention to the small community of Pinewood Creek. Davis initially entered a not guilty plea, but as the prosecution presented the overwhelming evidence against him, including his own confession, he changed his plea to guilty in exchange for providing testimony about the full extent of the exploitation ring. He was ultimately sentenced to 3 consecutive life terms without the possibility of parole, effectively ensuring he would spend his remaining days in prison. Thomas Weber had escaped earthly justice through his death in 2010, but the investigation into his activities posthumously revealed his extensive role in the criminal enterprise. Financial records discovered in his storage unit led investigators to hidden accounts containing profits from the exploitation operation. These assets, totaling nearly $2 million, were seized and placed in a trust for the benefit of the victims' families and for organizations supporting child protection initiatives. Richard Thornton, identified as the primary architect of both the exploitation ring and the murders, had similarly evaded legal consequences through his death. However, his reputation was posthumously destroyed as the details of his crimes became public knowledge. The nursing home where he had spent his final years reported that he had frequently experienced terrifying nightmares, calling out names that staff now recognized as belonging to his victims. His dementia, according to medical records, had been characterized by paranoid delusions of being pursued and punished for unnamed sins. The families of the three boys experienced the revelations with complex emotions. Robert Miller, who had never given up searching for answers about his son, expressed a mixture of vindication and renewed grief. In a statement to the press, he said the confirmation of what happened to Jason brought closure, but also revived the pain of knowing how his son had suffered in his final moments. He expressed pride in learning that the boys had discovered the criminal operation and had bravely attempted to alert authorities, dying as a result of their courage rather than through carelessness, as had been suggested. The Walkers, who had channeled their grief into advocacy for missing children, announced the establishment of a new foundation specifically focused on improving safety protocols and background checks for youth camps and programs. The Timothy Bennett Memorial Scholarship was created by Linda Bennett to support students pursuing careers in criminal justice and child protection services. For Eleanor Winters, whose terminal diagnosis had prompted her to come forward with her suspicions, the resolution of the case brought a measure of peace in her final months. She passed away in December 2019, having lived long enough to know that her courage had helped bring truth to light. At her request, a small memorial was placed near Pine Lake, honoring both the three boys and her role in eventually revealing their fate. The Pine Lake property itself became the subject of controversy. Some community members advocated for demolishing all remaining structures and creating a memorial park, while others argued for preserving the site as a historical reminder of the need for vigilance in protecting children. Ultimately, the county government acquired the land through eminent domain, removing the deteriorating buildings and establishing a nature preserve with a modest memorial commemorating the three boys. The investigation into the broader exploitation network continued for years, resulting in numerous arrests and prosecutions across the country. Many of the original clients had died in the intervening decades, but digital records recovered from various sources enabled authorities to identify individuals who had continued similar activities into the present day. The Pine Lake case became a landmark example cited in law enforcement training about the importance of cold case review and the potential for new technologies and circumstances to resolve long unsolved crimes. For the community of Pinewood Creek, the revelations brought a painful reckoning with the past. Many older residents expressed guilt at having accepted the drowning narrative so readily and having allowed suspicious circumstances to go unquestioned. Younger generations, learning of the tragedy for the first time, struggled to reconcile the idyllic image of their hometown with the darkness that had lurked beneath its surface. The case prompted a nationwide review of procedures and regulations governing youth camps and programs. The Pine Lake Act, passed by the Michigan legislature in 2021, established more rigorous background check requirements and mandated multiple layers of supervision for all youth residential programs. Similar legislation was subsequently adopted in numerous other states, creating a lasting legacy from the tragedy that might prevent future crimes against vulnerable children. On July 12, 2023, the 45th anniversary of the disappearance of Jason Miller, Christopher Walker, and Timothy Bennett, a permanent memorial was unveiled at the Pine Lake Nature Preserve. The simple granite monument featured three bronze silhouettes representing the boys, positioned as if walking together toward the future they had been denied. Beneath the silhouettes, an inscription read, "Three young heroes who chose truth over safety, whose courage ultimately brought light to darkness." The dedication ceremony was attended by surviving family members, including Robert Miller, now in his 80s, supported by his grandchildren from his second marriage. The Walker family was represented by Christopher's younger sister, who had been only 5 years old when her brother disappeared. Linda Bennett had passed away in 2022, but her memory was honored by former students from her teaching career who spoke of how she had channeled her grief into caring for other children. The Pine Lake case continues to resonate in discussions about institutional responsibility, the protection of children, and the importance of listening to those who raise concerns about suspicious behavior. Law enforcement agencies around the country now use the case as a training example of how predators can exploit positions of trust and how seemingly perfect community members can conceal dark secrets behind carefully constructed facades of respectability. The courage of three 14-year-old boys who recognized evil and attempted to expose it at the cost of their lives serves as both a warning and an inspiration. Their actions, though tragically cut short, ultimately led to justice and potentially saved countless other children from similar exploitation. In death, they accomplished what they had set out to do in those final desperate hours of their young lives. They brought truth to light and forced a community, and eventually a nation, to confront the reality that evil can exist in the most trusted institutions and individuals. At Pine Lake, now restored to its natural beauty, visitors often report a sense of both sadness and peace. Some claim to have seen, in the early morning mist that rises from the water, the silhouettes of three boys walking along the shore, finally free to continue their journey together. Whether this is merely legend or something more remains part of the mystery that continues to surround Pine Lake, a place where tragedy and redemption, darkness and light, remain forever intertwined in the collective memory of all who know its story.